ننتقل مباشرة إلى المتحدث الرابع والأخير في هذه الجلسة، وهو الأستاذ الدكتور خيرالدين يوجيسوي. والأستاذ الدكتور خيرالدين يوجيسوي هو أستاذ في جامعة واشنطن، وهو متخصص في التاريخ الإسلامي، وسيحدثنا اليوم عن موضوع ما قبل الحضارة، بعض المفاهيم القائمة حول الجماعات البشرية في الشرق الأوسط المبكر. فليتفضل مشكورا.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. كنت أتمنى أن أتكلم باللغة العربية، لكن عربيتي مثل السيارة القديمة تحتاج إلى صيانة. buradan bir şey yapayım. tamam bir şey yapayım. تشكرا. لذلك سوف أتحدث باللغة الإنجليزية. My subject is about the notion or the concept of civilization. And you see from the title, I said before civilization, because the word civilization has a history that does not go back earlier than the middle of the 18th century. And I think it is important to think about this notion that is so recent, but so influential that it came to provide a perspective, a framework, a lens for us to understand, categorize, and identify variety of human assemblies or collectivities. So I think, because of this concept requires a critical engagement, thinking about what this concept is and how we can provide some constructive critique of this concept. So this is one part of my lecture or talk. The second half of my talk is about providing few examples from premodern Islamic literature, when there was no concept of enlightenment civilization, to identify or to actually examine how they identified and defined human collectivities, small and large. And I think most probably some of the results are going to be known, but some of them I think are going to be surprising to you. My operating assumption is that the word civilization is not just a word or a concept. It is actually a discourse. It has its history, and that history is intimately tied to European Enlightenment in the 18th century. That is based on a linear progressive history that eventually produces European modernity and the supremacy of Europe. And I think if that is really, the origins of the word civilization, then, it does require some, critical reflection, because it does line up human history in a linear progressive trajectory, that whatever you do, at the end of the day, it produces certain society, certain history as the backbone of human life. And it does more than that too. It reorders and reorganizes pre-modern knowledge in categories that render it useful for the epistemic regime that the capitalist enlightenment has engendered. Because it provides a perspective through which we understand actually how human beings lived their life. And that trajectory eventually produces the knowledge or the epistemologies produced in the Enlightenment. And probably we can flesh out this during the question-answer sessions. Therefore, my contention is that translating the word civilization into our own vernaculars, Turkish, Arabic, Persian, and other languages, whether we call it hadara, whether we call it tamaddun, whether we call it madaniyat, whether we call it umran, does not do good and does not do more than reproducing European Enlightenment, European modernity in our own vernaculars. And I think this is a problem in itself that we have to address. And this is the title of the slide, Invention of Civilizations. It is not that there were civilizations over there that we now describe them with a particular word. The word itself created civilization. That is really my when you produce that word, when you articulate that word, then you create a reality through which you understand human assemblies. And if you remove, I'll ask you for 1 or 2 minutes, if you remove that word from your own mental map, think about how you might view human assemblies, small or large. Right? And I'll give you a map in here so that to produce that really difference or the binary between the two. You have a world map in here. This is a very simple map. There is nothing really specific about it. People, variety of activities. It reflects certain cultures, right? So it is your task to categorize this map, right? And you can do it in so many ways. But here, when you talk about civilization, it provides a map through which now you think about how human societies are organized, how they are distinguished from each other. You have this map in here. That is a simple map based on the notion of civilization that we are aware of. Then you categorize the societies, human societies, in different parts of the world under, umbrella terms. And I think because of this, it is important to think about the concept itself. That whether there are other ways to think about human communities. In summary, the notion of civilization or the concept of civilization is a construct that has a particular history. And whatever word we use to describe a human assembly or community or association, we articulate certain judgments, pre-commitments, positions, and priorities. And therefore, it is not a simple matter to talk about culture, to talk about cultures and human communities by using such a concept. But, if we know what it means, if we can critically engage it, if we have really studies behind it, and we think this is a reality that we want to describe, then we probably should go ahead and describe it as such. But what I'm saying is that, before doing this type of really self-reflection, before studying it, it only produces what has been produced in the European Enlightenment. Then therefore, trying to describe human communities in this way or another way is always a political enterprise. It's always a political intervention. So what kind of politics that one wants to produce in describing human collectivities? I think this is an important question to think about. Then the question is, therefore, how can we produce a humane, constructive, and egalitarian notion or notions of human collectivities? How can we produce a concept that is going to be fair and egalitarian without antagonizing other human communities, right? And define identities without othering those who do not share the same identity as ours. And what are some other ways to think about human collectivities? And here it brings me to pre-modern literature and their notions of human collectivities. There are a number of words that the scholars in pre-modern times, that is really, for me, it is 14th century before, that try to define, describe, and categorize large-scale human collectivities. This was also a way for scholars to understand the world in which they lived. They signified assemblies and groups or societies above immediate kinship ties, underlining lifestyle, sometimes beliefs, sometimes political organizations, sometimes geographic association. And the vocabularies that they used, sometimes interchangeably, sometimes overlapping, is umma and umam, mulk, mulukiya, ijtima' bashari, ijtima' madani, milla, qawm, and in the case of Ibn Khaldun, obviously, umran. So then we already have a plurality of descriptions of human assemblies. And therefore, using the notion or the concept of civilization is already actually impoverishing and reducing the intellectual plurality and richness of the tradition itself. Here, I'll give you a couple of examples from Al-Yaqubi, Al-Mas'udi, hopefully Al-Farabi and Al-Biruni as well, to see how they actually try to understand human communities. Al-Yaqubi was a historian of the 9th century, as you know, discusses human communities as rooted in two institutions which produce different collectivities. Prophets produce communities of faithful. Kings produce political communities, that is, subjects, right? And then, in history, for example, if you read the first 200 pages of history, you would know that he starts with the creation, the fall of Adam, and then continues with the history of the sons of Adam and the prophets, and then he started talking about the diversity of human community, right? The spread of human beings around the earth. And then after certain point, he brings royal authority or kingship into the discussion as one of the engines of human collectivity. What really brings human together becomes this notion of royal authority or kingship. Especially he does so after he discusses the Babylonians. Noticing the diversity of human communities beyond faith and kingship, and that is more like earlier phases of human history, Al-Yaqubi constructs a knowledge of human assemblies based on perceived similarities and differences. Right? He looks at variety of societies or human communities, and then he tries to actually categorize them based on what he thinks that they were similar in and then different from each other. And he talks about peoples ruled by kings, each of which represented by a distinct dominant tradition or a significant world historical contribution. So that, either he talks about, for example, either whether there is a particular geography, particular cultural zone that made a contribution that went beyond their zone, or whether there is a distinct tradition that, he notices that is different from other societies. So this would be one way of approaching the subject for Al-Yaqubi. Interesting point. Identities are not necessarily always faith-based, right? He does obviously, distinguish communities based on their faith. Christians, Muslims, Jews, Zoroastrians, and this and that. But the notion of human assembly is beyond faith similarity. A particular human assembly, for example, could contain different faith traditions, but they would still be considered within the same quote-unquote cultural zone. The biggest example of that I can think of is India, for example, when he talks about India, it does have a multitude of religions or faith traditions, but yet he talks about India as a particular cultural zone. Another actually more interesting example is when he talks about the Greeks and the Romans. He talks about the Greeks and the Romans as one, quote unquote, again, cultural zone. But he also knows that, the ancient Greeks were pagans, right? But the Romans became Christians after Constantine converts to Christianity. Then the Byzantine or Eastern Roman emperors becomes Christians. But this does not make them actually different cultural zones. He put them again together. So that means actually for him, faith is not the primary marker of the cultural zones that he talks about. And he does so with other examples as well. But he does not use a particular concept. Like, for example, we see Al-Mas'udi, Al-Biruni, Al-Farabi do use umam to describe what we probably call today something similar, what we mean by using the word civilization, right? But for them, that is really ummah or umam. At the end of the day, for Al-Yaqubi, unlike Ibn Khaldun, umam are sedentary societies, right? Citied societies. He excludes, for example, nomadic societies from his framework. But, when he talks about the umam, he really means citied, sedentary societies. This is his own perspective. For Ibn Khaldun, it is different, right? Ibn Khaldun talks about both of them. Or societies that he does not see they have made significant contribution to larger geographic areas. An interesting example that we can also talk about, sorry. It's you did it? Oh, thank you. Al-Farabi is an interesting example. As we know, the word we use today in Persian and Turkish, tamaddun or madaniyat, is by and large driven from Al-Farabi's use of Medina. In fact, actually, when you read Al-Farabi himself, he does not talk about something that we mean today. For him, again, the primary category of large human assemblies is ummah or umam. And let me, I'll have to summarize Al-Farabi. He talks about three kinds of societies: large, medium, and small. The small one is the city, and that is the minimum size for him to consider them basically a perfect society. اجتماع كامل. The middle one, and that is really the core of his theory about this issue, is ummah or umam, which is basically that contains variety of diverse cultures and groups that form a community at large, that is distinguished from others by three characteristics, right? شيم طبيعية and خلق طبيعية and ألسنة, right? Natural characteristics, natural disposition, and languages. And the language is attribute of the previous two characteristics. And the largest one is Jam' al-Jumu'ah, Ummah of Umams, and that is really the world community. That thinks about this paradigm that really goes, we are all human beings composed of communities that form ummah of umams, and then we have the umams, and then we have cities, right? For Al-Farabi too, like Al-Mas'udi and like Al-Yaqubi, is that, if you are a villager, if you are a Bedouin, well, you cannot hope to attain perfection unless you go and join, a city, right? So this is for him. Whether we accept this or not is a different matter, but, this is how he sees perfect human assembly. See, for us, immediately would say civilized society, but for him it is not that. It is a perfect society. That, مجتمع كامل, اجتماع كامل, right? And then I'll have to skip this one because I noticed that I have only 4 minutes. Al-Mas'udi is an interesting polymath, historian, and many other things, who does talk about this matter actually quite extensively. And I invite everybody to think about Al-Mas'udi, to read Al-Mas'udi from this perspective. For our possibilities to construct notions to define human collectivities. And he does an excellent job actually of trying to understand and define human collectivities. He organizes his narrative of human assemblies around great events related to faith and kingship. And this probably is a surprising point for many of us. I mean, the kingship keeps coming up. Kingship by which I mean mulk, right? Mulukiya. Al-ahdath al-idham al-diniya wal-mulukiya. This is something for him that defines really human community and human history. He seeks a broader category of cultural and political commonality to describe large associations. So he is aware, or not he is aware actually, he thinks that humans live in larger communities. And his primary question is that how to define them, right? How to define these large communities. He divides large human groups, or zones of cultures, if we want to say that, into 2 primary categories. Regions united under regions united under either kings or ummas with common feature, mamalik and right? He makes umam, his primary area of focus and main signifier of large socio-cultural zones. So for him, for example, is the main really parameter or axis on which to understand and define human communities is the notion of the ummah itself. And again, he uses it not in jurisprudential fiqhi understanding that religious community. For him, ummah is actually much larger than any faith group. So, presumably, ummah in which Muslims and other faith communities could exist is possible for Al-Mas'udi. And Al-Mas'udi talks about how ummas differ from each other. And for him, there are actually 3 ways that they are distinguished from each other. One is that their faiths, so, you have different faiths. There are also differences in their outlooks, how they perceive love, how they lead love, how they practice in their life. So, diyanatihim wa ara'ihim, and then their habitats, the region in which they live. Right? This makes this broad differentiation among variety of communities. And he talks about great ummas being distinguished by 3 characteristics. And this is similar to Al-Farabi, you will recognize this one. Natural character, which is al-shiyam al-tabi'iyya, natural makeup, al-khilaq al-tabi'iyya, and then languages. It's almost identical to what Al-Farabi was saying, and it is also true for Al-Biruni. I don't have to talk about Al-Biruni, but Al-Biruni talks about in this vocabulary as well. Yet, because he feels that this is really too broad a category, or maybe it could exclude certain communities within the he brings two pillars actually to anchor a particular community in, which is basically united by a king, which we might call, for example, like somebody like the caliph or like the Roman emperor, right? You know, an overarching king or ruler who actually oversees lesser kings or governors. And the second one is a common language, which is basically what he talks about is the lingua franca, what we call lingua franca, the high language. Like, you know, Arabic being the high language of the societies from the 8th century to the 11th century. Then Persians comes up and then becomes actually the lingua franca of all sorts of people from Bengal all the way to the Balkans actually in the 13th century. So that is really the language that he is talking about, that unite all of these umams, knowing that other languages do, you know, exist and they are spoken as well, but, you know, overarching political authority and a common language that unite them all. Well, thank you very much. Shukran kathiran.